And we're going to begin disassembly of this M5OD transmission with removal of the shifter. Most of the bolts are already removed. I'll remove this last bolt. Unless the service information tells you differently, on most manual transmissions, you're going to want the transmission in neutral before you begin disassembly. And typically the shifter is one of the first things that we're able to remove, not always. So make sure you're referring to service information for the transmission you're working on. You might service the shifter even with the transmission in the car. There are some bushings here in the shifter that do sometimes become a little bit worn. So if the shifter is simply sloppy, you might need to disassemble and service those bushings in there. And with the transmission in neutral, we should be able to pull the shifter straight up. And underneath here, we see two of our shift forks. And then we see a lever sticking out that's going to go back to our fifth and reverse assembly. We'll get to that in a little bit later. But these two shift forks are going to be our 1-2 shift fork and our 3-4 shift fork. Now remember, when we're operating the manual transmission, when we move the shifter from one side to the other, what we're doing, we're selecting which of these shift rails we're ultimately going to move. And then when we move the shifter from forward to back, that's when we'll actually move a shift fork. So it's a little easier with it out to grab the shift fork and move it. So here's my 3-4 shift fork, and I'm able to put that in one in the forward, in the rear, or a little bit harder to get back into the neutral position. There we go. So I've got that shift fork back in neutral, and now I'd be able to move my 1-2 shift fork. Now there are some interlock devices, some pins that come out between the two shift rails, and that prevents one shift fork from moving when the other one's not in neutral. So when this shift fork is back in the rearward position, which would be first gear, I believe, when that's in first gear, I'm not able to move this shift fork. I've got to get that one back to neutral before I'm able to move my fourth and third gear shift fork. And again, when that one's not in neutral, I can't move the 1-2. So that's the function of a shift interlock in the shifter assembly. Another thing I want to talk about on shifters, wouldn't be popular on this particular transmission, but you hear the term a short throw shifter. What a short throw shifter is, in the aftermarket, they'll move the pivot point or the fulcrum of this shift lever up a little bit, effectively making the bottom portion of the shift lever a little longer and the top portion of the shift lever a little bit shorter. And that makes it so that the throw or the shifting action is a shorter action for the driver, and that'd be popular in muscle cars or in sport compacts for a little more spirited driving. But when you hear the term a short throw shifter, that's what that is. In the aftermarket, they change that pivot position ever so slightly. So that's a look at the shifter assembly for the M5OD transmission.